Well, it's time to start working on the doors. Big step today. Come on with me, lots of work to do. Welcome to vanofaction.com, where we're taking a 2018 Dodge Promaster van and turning it into a family camper. Along the way, we're sharing the journey, the good, the bad, the ugly, hoping that we can make your journey a little bit easier. If you find this useful, please give us a like, give us a share, and give us a subscribe, because we could really use the love. This week, we're talking about cabinet doors, something that sounds pretty tough, but if you think about it the right way and you approach it with the right system, it can be pretty easy. Come on along, let's show you how we're doing. Working on the doors. Doors are the focal point of any cabinet. They just are, is what you see. In this particular case, again, because I don't want to feel like we're riding down the highway in a barrel, I'm going to be using cedar for the frame of the door, but the biggest part of the door, the panel of the door, is going to be a plywood panel, painted a light blue, and then on top of that will be some caning material laminated on top. I don't have all the samples here to show you, but it's my daughter's vision, and I think it's excellent. It's going to work out just fine. The blue paint will pick up the blue, a bit of the blue in the vinyl and the back seats, and it should look good. I think it's going to look excellent. So today I'm working on the frame of the doors. And this is the cedar, the same 1x5, 1x6 tongue and groove cedar that I've been using all throughout the van. It's all clear, it's all select, it's all kiln dried. And I asked these fellas, because of COVID, I couldn't pick it out myself. And this is a time when I would normally go to the lumberyard and spend an hour picking out, selecting each piece for each that I wanted to use. But because of COVID, excuse me, that's not possible. So I asked them, and they did a nice job. They picked out some really nice dark pieces for me. It's going to look nice. I've cut the tongue and the groove off. That's the little strips that are sitting out there on the grass. And then I've machined it so that it was all 2 inches wide. So I've got square stock, about 3/4 of an inch thick, 2 inches wide. And from this, I'm going to machine my frames. I've been very careful to make sure that I keep the pieces in pairs. This was one board. This was one board. This was one board. You get the idea. The reason for that is I want all the horizontal pieces to run through for the whole length of the cabinet to be the same piece of wood running with the grain in the same direction. All the vertical pieces will be the same piece of wood running in the same direction. So I want to be very careful about how I label these. This pair, if they were horizontal, would be the top of the doors, and the other piece, the mating piece, would be the bottom of the doors. And they'd be set so the grain was right. See, in this case, it's important that the flour, the grain, run true. So that's what I'm doing right now, is just figuring out where all the pieces are going to go. I have all the pieces sorted, rough measured, labeled, and I've kept a log in my book to know which is where and where they're all going to go. And now I have to do the machining for this lumber. And let me just explain to you how it's going to go together. When it comes time to do your doors, you've got several choices. You can make your door just one flat piece of plywood and paint it, and that would be fine, paint it or stain it. You can make it one flat piece of lumber and paint it or stain it, and that would be fine. But if you want to add a little character and a lot of strength and less weight, you'll make a frame around the outside of your door, and you put a panel on the inside. And that panel ideally would be plywood, because plywood is light and strong. And that could be the finished product right there if you wanted it to be. You could stain that, you could paint that, whatever you wanted to do. I'm going to add another dimension, which is a bit of caning material to the inside of the panel. It's going to add a little texture to the product. I think I'm going to try it anyway. I'm going to like that. It really doesn't matter. The theory is exactly the same. All you need to do is calculate what you're going to put inside that groove, and that'll tell you how big the groove needs to be. And the machining of it couldn't be simpler. It couldn't be easier. Let me show you how you lay that out. The cedar panel, the rails of the doors are going to look like this. And in the edge of it, I'm going to machine a groove. All the grooves will be the same. And then in that groove will be machined to accommodate the little piece of plywood that's going to go in, and then the caning material that'll go on top of it. It'll all fit into the groove. That's the way the side panel, or a section of the door is going to look. And by doing it this way, the way that the pieces will come together on the corners will be exactly the same thing. I'll use that same groove, and then where the piece comes up against it, I will machine a tongue. And this groove and this groove and tongue will be the same. That way it just saves a lot of setup time. And again, the fewer times you measure, the fewer mistakes you can make. So I don't want any end grain exposed, so the door will look like this. The side panels, if you can see that, the side panels will go from top to bottom, and the horizontal pieces will be cut in between them. So this horizontal piece will be that joint. So each of these I have to add whatever depth that's going to be twice, right? And again, just to make it easy, I'm going to make this depth 3/8 of an inch. And makes it easily, it makes the mathematics easy then. Because I need to do a tongue on each end, it'll be 3/4 of an inch longer, right? It'll look like this. And 3/8 of this end, 3/8 of this end. I take the measurement I need for the overall door, subtract 2 inches and 2 inches, which is 4 inches. Take the overall length minus 4 inches. That'll give me the length of the exposed piece of wood. Add 3/4 of an inch to that, and that'll give me the length of my blank that I need before I machine the ends on. I would normally cut all of these grooves in the edges now while the pieces were still full length. But unfortunately, it's a rainy day. And in order to work with full lengths, I've got to have my saw outside, just the way my life is. So I'm going to, I think, cut them to the shorter lengths now, and I can bring the saw indoors and work in under the little bit of roof that I have. That's the next step. It's time to start machining the doors for real. And I'm so glad we finally got to this point, because I've been looking forward to sharing this with you. As I've been doing the van build, I've had people commenting on how beautiful the woodwork looks, how wonderful it is, a high, top quality, journeyman carpentry, excellent carpentry. And thanks so much for saying that. And I am happy with the way it's looking. It's looking really good. But the reality of it is, all I've been doing is cutting wood straight over and over and over again. 95% of cabinet making is being able to cut 2 pieces of wood the same size. That's the honest truth. That's all there is to it. And when it comes to machining doors, that would be considered the higher end of cabinet making. In a cabinet making shop, the most experienced sawman would be doing the machining of the door frames. This is the way it works. There's very little room for mistakes. I want to share with you my saw. This is a Crafts, and it's a Makita, but it's a handyman saw. It has a plastic top, it has screw-in throat, it's got dents and things all over it. It's not my saw, it's in the saw that came with the shop that I rented for the winter. And it's really hard to cut 2 pieces of wood the same size as this. If I get too narrow, the wood starts to fall into the throat. It's a real challenge. But I'm going to show you how. If you have a saw like this, in 10 minutes, you can make it a fine precision cutting machine. So stick with me on this one. What I've done is I've taken a flat piece of plywood, and I've taken 2 other pieces of plywood and screwed them together so they were at 90 degrees with each other. And I've taken the 2 pieces I screwed together and I placed them on the bigger piece of plywood so they were parallel to one side. I was very, very careful, and I made this fence parallel with this piece of plywood. And I know that it's exactly 6 1/8 inches from this piece of plywood, hope you can see that, to this side of the fence. 6 1/8 inches. I know that for a fact. So I know that if I set my fence of the saw 6 1/8 inches to the edge of the saw blade, it's going to come up just inside of this fence, just beautifully. And I know, because I did my calculations earlier, that I want to have 3/16 of an inch between this fence and the saw blade. That's how much of a shoulder I want. So I take 6 1/8. I'm sorry, here I misspoke and started making up a bunch of numbers. You want to set your fence on your saw so that the fence on the plywood is the correct distance away from the saw blade, so you get the shoulder that you need in order to create the groove that you want to make in your door frame. It's really that simple. All you're doing is moving your fence away from the blade. Clap that fence down. That's good. Now what I'm going to do is lower the blade. I'm going to lower the blade all the way down so it's below the face of the table. Okay. The blade's gone. Now when I move this fence over, the plywood over to the fence, and this is where you got to be careful. You make your plywood big enough that it overhangs the table here and rests above the fence, the guard fence. You got to be able to clamp that down somehow. So I have a spacer, and I'll put a clamp on that to hold it. And then I want to hold this end of it down. That's easily done, just with another clamp. If this was my table saw, I would have made the fence big enough to be able to screw it to my table around the board, like my work table around it. I don't want to put a lot of holes in somebody else's bed, so. There. Now, I should be able to turn the saw on, raise the blade up, and I should have what I want to have. Let's see if it worked. Now the blade's just poking through. I want to check and make sure I've got it right before I get too carried away. We are exactly 3/16 of an inch. Exactly. 3/16 of an inch. So now, if I was to take this, I have two grooves. And between those grooves, is exactly 5/16 of an inch. Exactly what I want. So now all I have to do is I can cut the same cut on both sides and then just drag out the middle of it. Couldn't be easier. Okay, there's the first two passes done to establish the outside shoulder on each board. Now we just have to take out the center part, which is easy. I'll change the setup. I'll do that again. The hardest part about this whole job is keeping the pieces of wood straight in your head in terms of which one goes where, what side you're going to be machining on. I put tape markers on the edge so I know which side I'm not supposed to cut on. And because it's symmetrical, it doesn't matter right at this moment in time, it doesn't matter which is the face, which is the bottom, which is the top. I know as long as I've got this tape up and I'm pushing each side against the fence, I'm getting exactly the same cut on each shoulder. That's what I need to know right now. I'm going to change the setup. I've got to stop for a little while. I'll come back and get going again. Now, cutting pieces the same length. This is really simple. I use my miter fence that came with the saw, and I put a little bit longer piece on it so to give me more purchase, and made sure that it was cutting square. Then I built a small L-shaped block to use as a stop that I could clamp onto that larger piece of wood, so that every piece would be stopped at the same place. And along the top of the fence, you'll see the green masking tape. I very carefully, one time, measured from the cutting edge of the saw blade and put a mark 2 inches from that point on the masking tape. Then every piece I need to measure after that, I measure from that 2-inch mark on the masking tape. Just take a couple inches off the length. It's easier than trying to figure out where the edge of the blade is. Here I just cut 10 pieces exactly the same length in a matter of minutes. And here we are, completely machined. Now there's going to be some handwork. You have to check every corner. You want your tongues and your grooves to fit together snugly, not too tight. You don't want the tongue to cause the groove to swell out, and you certainly don't want it to be loose. So you've got to check every corner and group the doors exactly as they're going to go together. And then it's time to assemble them. And to do that, we use exactly the same clamping table we used for the cedar skin work we did for the cabinets. But in this case, I've added one extra piece, and that is one perfectly square corner at one end. The doors will be different sizes, and this clamping table can be adjusted for every different size of door. First thing you do is you line up your 4 pieces, make sure you've got them oriented the way you want them to be, face side up. I always put the top at the back side and the bottom facing me. Get them lined up the way you want them to fit, make sure they're okay. And then, because you've got unique size doors, you set this clamping table up specifically for this door. The first thing you use is a piece of scrap wood against the stock to make sure you don't mar the cedar as you start to clamp it. And then I take a piece of scrap block with a wedge and I screw it down. Now, I try to get every inch out of my screws, so they tend to be a little bit worn before I'm finished with them. There we go. Now I'll put one of these on each side, and you'll notice that those blocks are right in line with the corners. That's where you want to clamp. The middle of the door means nothing. Clamp on the corners. And once you've got those in place, I'm set to go. So I very carefully make sure I've got all the tape taken off, get everything exactly where it's supposed to go, and then it's time to start thinking about the glue. Now when you start to glue it, the more glue you put on, the more mess you may have to clean up. So you want to be careful. You don't want to be stingy with the glue, but you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to goop it out all over the place. Just put it where you need to have it. And you glue the one end and the one rail that are going against the fence to begin with. Put a little glue on the tongue. And then just set those together so that they're square in the corner and they're nice and neat. Then you get your panel and start putting the panel in. Now this panel work, depending on how you build your doors, I had the caning on the outside face of my panels, and that caused a bit of an issue with trying to slide it into the groove because you want it to be snug, and so in times the caning would bind and start to gather up a little bit. So I had to be a little bit more careful putting them together. Certainly possible. You just have to be a little bit more patient. If you had a solid wood panel, it would slide in really easily, no trouble at all. And once you've got that panel set into place, you take the other 2 pieces and put the glue on those. This is the kind of a job that once it's glued up, you have to let it sit for 20 minutes to or half an hour. So you do one door and then go off and do something else. Come back and take it apart, set up, do the next door, and then go off and do something else. You can't do all your doors at one time. Very, very careful as you wiggle the panel in because you want to try and keep the first joint as tight and as true as you can. This is fun work. It's neat to see. You can see what you've got done. I have urethaned all this cedar before I assembled it because I thought it'd be easier than trying to cut in on the caning material. You may choose to finish yours after it's all assembled, in which case the cleanup would be a little bit less of a concern maybe. Once you've got the 4 pieces set, you always check and make sure that the piece you're putting on hasn't moved the pieces you've already put in place. And then you put the stock in. Now, before I wedge it, I know that when I put pressure on the end of the door, there's going to be a knuckle effect where the tongue and the groove go together. So I want to hold it down flat and make sure the shoulders come together true. So at each end, I've got a piece of wood that I'll screw across my frame. And then I'll take a clamp and clamp those to the tabletop. But the clamping isn't very hard. Really, the clamp is just done tight enough that the clamp doesn't fall off the table. I just want to hold it down. I'm not trying to push it down. I just don't want to let it come up. And the other, not too tight. Check it all again, because you never know. You don't want anything to move. Once this is set, it's set. And then just take the wedges. This was a really skinny door, so I had to break off the end of one of my wedges. And tap them in before you really snug them up, take another look, make sure that everything's all right. And then you're done. And that'll sit there and give it 20 minutes, half an hour, let it set up, and you'll be fine. Come back and do it again. Next thing you know, a day or two later, all your doors are done. And that feels really good. When you can see your doors like this, it really feels good. Thanks for watching. Hope you found it useful. Cheers.